Jim will come in when he comes in. So we have Jean Turner from Louisiana State University. And I won't remember all your titles, Jean, but you're emeritus.
No, that's when you retire.
Oh, I'm sorry. What do I know about academia? I'm sitting here applying for teaching jobs, and I don't even know what emeritus means.
It means go away, but you do it comfortably, or do it carefully, out of sight.
Oh, comfortably. That sounds like a good plan. Anyway, one of Jean's major calls on history is that you have been in charge of monitoring the BP spill, which became something of a disaster. Is that correct?
It didn't go well. Nobody wants that amount of oil dumped on them.
Okay.
So.
And the various solutions didn't really help very much. And Susan, whom Jean is meeting now for the first time, you're just 2 years older than I am, is described on Wikipedia as a radical feminist philosopher, essayist, and playwright who has written 21 books. Is that correct? Or is it more?
It's 21, yeah.
21. And a number of them are extremely famous. One is Pornography and Silence, Culture's Revenge Against Nature, and The Roaring Inside Her.
It's called Woman in Nature, The Roaring Inside.
Woman in Nature, I'm sorry. And I'm looking for the correct title on what I consider the most famous one about stones, or rather that's in the...
A Chorus of Stones.
A Chorus of Stones, right. And what's notable about Susan's writing is how poetic it is about some issues that science writers write about, but Susan, you write about it with a different kind of emotional tone. And one of the things that you and I spoke about fairly recently was what is happening to all the animal species as the whole earth seems to be going extinct right now, not just the animals, but all the plants and probably most of the humans. So when I titled this Family Disruptions, what I had in mind was that so many indigenous peoples talk about the whole network of animal and other life as a family. And the way I have been seeing things for some time is that we are committing ecocide or eco-suicide in our own families, which is pretty damn disruptive. If Jim were here, I would quote something that we said in a New York Times article back in 2007 about raping the earth. So that kind of language is not unfamiliar in the sciences. Hi, Jim, there you are.
Sorry.
Let me explain first. Jim is the Dean of Arts and Humanities. Did I finally get that right, Jim?
No, Arts and Sciences, but you're close. Congratulations.
Well, all right, I'm improving.
Yep.
Okay.
Let me shut the door here so I don't bother the folks out.
Okay, so he is Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He's the former director of the Institute for Arctic and Alpine Research, where I am an affiliate. And Jim and I have been working together since 2007. It was about 2010 when Jean joined us. And these have been pretty informal conversations about the impact of climate change. And I was just explaining to Jean, Jim, I don't know how much you heard, who Susan is. Susan is considered a preeminent ecofeminist writer and philosopher who has written some of the most important books on the relationship between feminism and what ecofeminism, what is happening to the earth. So that includes A Chorus of Stones, The Private Life of War, Psychological Aspects of Violence, War, and Womanhood, Woman and Nature, The Roaring Inside Her, Rape, The Power of Consciousness. And I just wrote on Facebook this morning that I feel this country is being gang raped in public. And when I think gang raped, I think of a quote that you and I, Jim, agreed on for the New York Times back in 2007, which was that the planet is being raped. Well, whatever's left of the planet is being raped. Mm-hmm. So my only conclusion about that was that it doesn't take someone in the arts to notice that we're being raped. But very often it's the artists and the writers among us, including Susan, who can articulate the impact of that horror. So I'm not sure who wants to start off to address the topic of family disruptions.
Well, I'll start.
Please.
I think fundamentally, I think when you're talking about Western culture, it's a mistake to be monolithic in your description of that, as it would be for any people's, any culture. Western culture is complex, and there are many different strands, but there's a dominant strand, particularly with the American government right now, the presidency, which is based on dominance in every way, dominance in society and dominance of nature. And underneath that is a philosophical, not only a philosophical, but a psychological assumption. And that psychological assumption is that somehow we aren't entirely nature ourselves, human beings, that we are above and separate from nature, which of course is a very dangerous thought to have, because as we're destroying nature, we're committing suicide. So, and then we project, I'll just say something about feminism and let other people speak, but we project nature onto anyone described as the other. So you can't get rid of nature in your psyche. It's very obvious that you're a human being. We have to eat, we have to sleep. You know, we're part of the life cycle. But then that is projected onto others who in fact do prepare the food and clean up after us. And so it's women, people of color, and working class people who work with their hands. And so all of us as aggregate are looked at as closer to nature, more of nature. It's really an irrational system, but it's consistent in the dominant culture of the West right now.
Very eloquently stated and very succinct. Jean or Jim, would you like to comment about how you see that operating in the world of science right now?
Well, I mean, I agree 100% that the idea that we are not nature, or we are not part of nature, is a very dangerous thing. We are, obviously. I mean, from a scientific point of view, we're the major agent of change on the planet. And if the major agent of change on the planet isn't part of the system, then you're in big trouble. It is, I think, very dangerous for us to assume that we can be apart from nature and succeed as a species. That's not, it's interesting because historically, I think we have been distancing ourselves from nature. Although I certainly think that over the last, I don't know how many years, but maybe 100 years or so, the pendulum is swinging back. We now see ourselves more and more as part of the ecosystem, part of the planet, rather than being separated from that. And I think that that's healthy, because that is indeed the reality, the physical science reality. Dean, what do you think?
Well, the kind of of course, as everybody here would say, we're not separate. We are integrated in some ways, and the dominant narrative
Dean,
is.
can you speak into the microphone a little bit more, please?
Let me turn it up. Oh, it is up. Is that better?
Yes.
All right. So the narrative that we kind of pick up is coming from the same people that are doing all the extractive kind of me first actions, and that's been a lot. That's actually behind all of nature in the way that they're combining resources. It doesn't mean it's dominant, but they're trying to get the light, and like a leaf does, they're trying to get water like a desert plant does, and it's out of a kind of a basic sense of insecurity that we won't exist without the struggle to get that kind of power situation. But at the same time, we also have developed as part of getting that conglomeration of things that came into our life through genetics. We also have community and love and joy and music and, eloquence, and we have the other side of that. So there's kind of a push-pull here, and we're obviously on the wrong side of it right now. But they've always been there, and it's just dominant by the. I don't want to use the word wrong, although I mean that sounds right, but it's so extractive, it's so exploitive, and it denies the kind of human side, the community side, the family side of these other relationships that we have. I mean, I do need to eat. I don't eat much meat now, but I mean, I do need some food. I'm an extractor myself. I need to have calories, but there's a way to go about it. Somebody said, and the way not to go about it is something like, rape the earth and then go to Mars and do the same thing. No, we don't want to do that. The physical limits are, we are what we are. We're not going to change that for a long time. So we need to recognize all aspects of this, both childish, emotionally narrow viewpoint of not having connections, and also to have all those connections which got us where we are, you might say. I mean, that's how I was born. And that's the way most of us had mothers. So that's, a complex history to come to that point, and we're just throwing it away right now.
Speaking of being born, that brings up one of my favorite topics, which is population. And when Jim and I first started working, and I've been thinking a lot about that early work we did in 2007, Jim, two of the things that were so remarkable in what emerged from the visuals that we did studying various disrupted Gulf regions was how isolated the United States could be. That was really obvious in 2007 from our work. And the other was the sheer mass of migration caused by climate change and overpopulation. And I'm sure you all noted what's happened with Steve King and the quotations that have been on NPR from him, something to the effect of going to Germany and telling them to reproduce as much as possible to save their culture. These are kind of outrageous ideas, but I wonder, there's a real practical issue here, which is we've just got too many people. And I keep coming back to wondering, and I've mentioned this many times before, whether the appearance of the strong man like Putin or Trump is sort of a surrogate of Putin, is nature's biological corrective. We just cannot seem to get it into our heads that we cannot reproduce as much as we want to on a finite planet.
I don't think nature functions in that way. I do think there are correctives, but I don't think that it would come down to giving power to Putin, Trump, fascist leaders throughout the world. I think the corrective, of course, is global warming, you know, I mean, or climate chaos, and making it, challenging a lot of our major cities that are often on coasts as the sea levels rise, as the ocean warms and the sea level rises. I think that the other corrective is the human capacity to imagine and think. And let's hope that there is a major shift in consciousness. Things can look very grim at a certain point, and then there are these shifts in consciousness which are not graded gradually. They happen rather dramatically. I saw it happen in the late 50s with regard to McCarthyism, and it happened with regard to civil rights in the 50s and 60s, and then it happened with regard to feminism. Major shifts occurred in thinking. This is going to require something that is even more major. But you know, as was said earlier, that is shifting. The idea that we are not part of nature is becoming a more narrow point of view. More and more people are not only accepting that we're part of nature, but stating it and building ways of life and philosophies on that assumption. So maybe this will be a major shift that will change our behavior. I would just want to say one other thing about overpopulation, and that is Margaret Mead's work many years ago, in which she pointed out that people who have more wealth generally reproduce less because they don't suffer the death of children as often. So they're not trying to create a bulwark against that death, and also they don't need children to bolster the family income. So I think that if we focus on feeding the people who are alive decent employment, that will help with population.
I think this is a theme that you've come to fairly frequently in Washington, D.C., Jim, if I'm not correct, that a big answer to
clear that by far the least disruptive way to control population is to empower women, politically and economically in particular, but to empower them generally. And if you look at societies around the world that have low replacement rates, they are typically societies where women have more power, more authority. Now, having said that, there is no society out there where there's equality, and so we've got a ways to go. But back at some old talks that I've given about climate change, and I think going back 15 years, my last slide has been a slide on population, and it has evolved from something pretty straightforward where it just says, it's time that we dealt with population, and the best way to do that is to empower women, to now my last slide just says it's time to end male domination. And I started that slide about 10 years ago, and 10 years ago I didn't get very much of a reaction. At least I didn't get a positive reaction. Now I get very much, and times have changed. I get a very positive reaction when I show that slide now. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to have to go even harder in order to keep pushing people along that pathway.
Go for it. Trump went to New Orleans today, but he tweeted that he was going to Nashville because he was confused. He got to New Orleans and they chanted at him, "Lock him up." Not lock her up.
Yeah.
Lock him up.
Lock him up.
Yeah.
So it's possible that the times are changing. It would not be any too soon if they did. I'm curious, Jean, in your experience of monitoring and regulating what happened with BP, in the Gulf of Mexico. What was your experience of the influence of women in the administrative process to get to any good outcome? Because it seems like the whole thing was a fiasco. There was a lot of money thrown at the problem, monitoring, and nothing really emerged that solved a thing. But I wonder if women had had more power, that might have been different. But perhaps they did have power, and it still wasn't different.
Well, on this specific case, Marcia McNutt was head of what we have as the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, and she and the woman was head of NOAA, and they did things in the Obama administration that they really took. They did their job, and they went beyond that, and they did a great job. The problem was the oil was already spilled, but they overruled things. They brought things out in the open. They made, and also Rita Caldwell was head of NSF, and she became head of a large pot of money that's now closing to have it for mostly academics to figure out what went wrong. So I would say in those three cases that they had a lot of influence, and they did a great job, and they got awards for it. And I'm not sure. And then after Trump's election, the guy that used to be head of DNR at Department of Natural Resources in Louisiana became part of Trump's cabinet, and he revoked a lot of Obama's rules. So it was crazy. They did a good job. They had rules to prevent or at least minimize this happening in the future, and then they reversed them when they were put out. So I would say in this specific case, the women and the head of our particular portion, not all of it, of this grant, of course, is my wife, and she's still female. So I got 4 of them, here. So I'd say they did a great.
MacArthur.
Well, she did.
So how do we get rid of the bad men?
Well, it's not men and it's not women. It's poor behavior. And there needs to be not only a seat at the table, but I would push for active assessment, active inclusion, more than they're doing now. Now they say, oh, everybody can come to the table. No, I think you actually have to have quotas until we get over this.
Yeah.
I've been through the civil rights, and I know how that worked. Passivity and volunteerism did not work. That's why we had the Civil Rights Act. So I think people have to make it happen. But I'm not in charge.
Suzanne Lacey is a mutual friend of Susan and I, and it was Suzanne who had suggested that Susan might join us today. And the last conversation that Suzanne and I had, we both started out as performance artists in the early 70s, and the first major performance that we collaborated on was with Judy Chicago and a woman named Sandra Orgel, was a piece called Ablutions about rape. And ever since, we have had a conversation, an ongoing conversation now going on 50 years, of what's the most important thing to do in order to achieve a feminist agenda. And the 2 things that we identified were that Suzanne's agenda is to champion inclusivity, and my own agenda is to champion transparency. From what you're saying, Dean, it sounds like transparency was there, but then other agents took over the question of inclusivity. Is that pretty much what happened politically?
Well, I mean, you elected a different president. So they reverse things. But if you look at the kind of 1,000-year history of Europe, I mean, it is slowly making progress, and the United States even. And we've revoked a lot of laws. We wonder how they ever came to fruition. But I mean, it used to be, well, anyhow, we have made progress. It just isn't very fast progress. And it's, as David Brooks said today in the column, it's a thin crust of civilization. So it can be reversed easily and penetrated and broken up if you're not nurturing it all the time. Civilization, I mean. So,
Well, Jim, you have your pulse on the relationship between science and government. It's looking pretty bleak these days. Do you have any signs of hope that you can point to? You're always our hope, Cassandra. Give us some hope.
Our resident optimist?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't really changed my thinking on this. I think that you have a couple of aces in the hole, so to speak. One of them is the reality that physics is physics, and the climate's going to change if you put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It doesn't matter what Trump says. Sea level's going to rise. It doesn't matter. You can't pass laws against that. So there is there's a physical reality that I take comfort in. But I think there's also, my optimism springs from primarily my belief that the dominant human tone, if you will, is good, and that we are headed in a direction in which we are better creatures, and not from an economic sense, but from a moral and societal sense. And I agree with Jean that you got to always be vigilant. You cannot assume that you're just going to get there. You got to keep trying. You got to keep pushing, which is why we have these conversations. But I think that in general, that's the direction we are going in, and we just have to make sure we stay on the path.
Oh, you're way more optimistic than I am.
I know. Well, it's been that way for a decade, right?
Yes.
But I think
more than a decade now. Susan, would you like to comment on that issue of optimism?
Well, I think it really is true that that's the direction we're going in. The problem is I'm writing a book now called Strong Man, and I'm making a link. There's underneath is practically everything in the book is a link between rape and fascism. They're really tied together. But one of the things I'm including in the book are these movements for embracing life and embracing life, including sensuality and sexuality and the body. And to embrace the body is to also acknowledge that we are part of nature. So there was a movement like that at the dawn of the century, at the end of the 20th century, the dawn of the 20th century, with all kinds of artists, including Klimt. And you look at this joy and this embracing of life, and I believe his work really elevates women. There are feminists who disagree with me, but I find him somebody who really appreciates feminine power, female power. And so, but all of the elements that we have in alternative movements now were there at that time. And then you had fascism, which arose, I think, largely as a response to World War I. So now I think we're in a similar position. We have this very positive movement, and we have the rise of fascism, and they're both. It's like that's been the central struggle of our civilization for quite a long time, and I think that in embracing reality, it involves self-knowledge, that this idea of this pattern, this psychological pattern of projecting physical and sensual reality onto the other, it really creates havoc in judgment, and Trump is giving us an incredible example of that, you know, where he's really very clearly irrational. But many leaders who pose as rational suffer from the same separation and delusion. It's really a delusion. So I want to add to the mix of things that need to be developed is self-knowledge. Self-knowledge on the part of people who are very privileged, so that they understand that they are part of nature and part of society.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Well, that's it. I just want to throw that into the mix. Domination. I loved what I believe it was what Jean said about insecurity. This, you know, that this urge to dominate comes from a sense of insecurity. If you embrace that insecurity and are conscious of it, you don't necessarily have to go on immediately to domination. That self-knowledge can be a source of strength, a feeling of strength.
One of the things I've been thinking about all morning before this webcast was exactly what goes on psychologically with rape. And the two things that I identified was projecting onto the victim the experience of shame and powerlessness.
And terror.
And terror, yes. And those are really crippling feelings. It's why rape leads to PTSD. I was curious as I was thinking about that, because so many people responded to what I wrote on Facebook about the USA being gang raped right now. They identified with that we're being shamed and left terrified and powerless as we're just raped over and over and over again by this ghastly orange narcissist in the White House and his accomplice in Russia. So my question about that to you, Susan, or if anybody else wants to respond, is how do you recover? How does a country, a nation, or a person recover from that depth of degradation, imposed degradation? Is it as simple as saying, oh, love, or is it more complicated?
Well, I think you have to, let's go to the Truth and Reconciliation hearings that were so famous in South Africa. People tend to, or the media tends to focus on reconciliation, forgetting truth. Establishing the truth in those hearings was critical. And that's something that I think we need, that's critical to healing. I mean, after all, Freud's whole method of healing was talk therapy, telling the truth. So the truth has to come out. It's beginning to, but I'm really looking forward to the democratic control of the House of Representatives, because there will be a lot of hearings and more truth will come out, more things will be stated. But in addition, democracy really is being raped also. It's us, but it's also democratic forms. And that's why I believe it's so important to seek impeachment, because when you let a crime like rape or a crime like the subversion of democracy go unnamed and unpunished legally, then it establishes a precedent of powerlessness of the people. So let me throw that into the mix, that I believe it's very, very important. Impeachment may not be politically popular at the moment, but I think it's understood that it's necessary to preserve democracy to begin impeachment proceedings.
But then the question is, what happens if we get Pence?
If we get Pence, you know, he'll be in charge for a brief period. He will not get reelected. He's not a very appealing person. That's my belief. But we can't always just think in terms of political maneuvering. I'm in favor of strategy. I oppose running candidates who are idealistically pure. I am in favor of progressives using strategy. However, if we're only strategic around this question of these violations of democratic rule and democratic norms, what we do is we establish that as okay, and we can't allow that. We have to defend democracy.
On this point of what we can and can't allow, because Jim and Jean are both indirectly and somewhat directly affected by the shutdown,
Yeah.
do you see any point of leverage on the stalemate that we're in politically? Either one of you?
Sorry, we have somebody that just.
Oh, good. Adrian?
Yeah.
Oh,
Hi.
hi. Oh, wonderful.
Hi.
So, Adrian, I didn't have a chance to pull up your Wikipedia entry, but you spearheaded the Feverish conference at the University of Vermont a couple of months ago that I was privileged to join you for. And we've just been talking about the rape of the earth and the rape of this country. And the reason I'm regretful that I haven't pulled up your Wikipedia entry is I can't properly introduce you with adequate references except that you're a brilliant thinker. And you're joining Jean, who's an expert on the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and Jim, who was one of the first, if not the first scientist to write about the remediation possible from greening the earth, and Susan Griffin, who is arguably the most important writer on ecofeminism today. So, with that introduction, Adrian, do you have any comments off the top of your head about what is happening to our planet just now?
Well, off the top of my head, hi, and it's wonderful to meet all of you, and it's an honor to be here among you. And also for all my brilliant thinking, I don't even think I have a Wikipedia entry. But as for what's happening to the planet, well, it's a long process, and we're in it for the long haul, I think. And if this country was the only one that's going rapidly in the wrong direction, that would be one thing. But there are so many places that are doing that, from Brazil to, all the authoritarian governments that are popping up in the most democratic, ostensibly democratic places. So I think it's more a matter of building the support for a movement that once it starts won't be stopped. And it's a little unpredictable to know when that'll happen, but I think we have to believe that it will. And I have hope that maybe the Sunrise Movement, is that what it's called? The Green New Deal and the the wave of new democratic, kind of radical Democratic Party activists, maybe an indicator of something like that. But and I think we need to support that movement, but with all such things, you never know where they'll lead, like the Occupy Wall Street and everything else, how long they'll last, and whether the waves will join into a larger tsunami, which basically is what we need, but a good tsunami. So those are my top of my head.
Well, Adrian, what I was specifically interested in and why I asked you to join us was because I was particularly struck by the sense of a clear vision at the Feverish conference that you organized in the fall. And I wonder if you would be willing to very briefly describe the origin of your idea for the Feverish conference, what your takeaway was. And I know that you tried to sustain some further development based on the takeaway from the conference. So could you describe that to us a little bit, please?
Sure. So it was called Feverish World, Arts and Sciences of Collective Survival. The full title was Feverish World 2018 to 2068, Arts and Sciences of Collective Survival. And part of the reason for that date is because I wanted us to think back towards 1968 and forward towards 2068, and also to give us a manageable time period, because I don't think 12 years is enough to prevent everybody from feeling so urgent that we'll be incapacitated, whereas 50 years might be a little more manageable. But the idea is that the world is feverish, is getting more feverish. Fever is a good thing. It's an indicator of something happening in the body, in the social collective earth body, maybe happening that we need to pay attention to. So we're trying to put a spin on, a positive spin or an optimistic, hopeful spin on something that clearly isn't. And I think that part of the thinking was that we need to think across boundaries, across cultural communities, across disciplines, bringing the arts, bringing artistic and creative thinking into the ways that we think and talk about the global predicament. And so we tried to work a little bit with metaphor, with Feverish World as a metaphor, but also, we didn't want to preload all of our conversations. We wanted to create a space where people were coming from somewhat different directions in order to think about how to imagine our situation in a way that grants us agency, that grants us a sense that we can collectively act despite the seeming political intractability and lack of agency, and all these huge global processes happening that seem to be happening without our collective participation. So that was the thinking. We brought a lot of artists, some of whom created these tent structures or worked with tent structures to create a kind of tent city that would be provocative. We did some work downtown in Burlington, a parade and this ice sculpture event that a Brazilian artist made. She's been doing it around the world. And part of it was to bring in people from outside in order to contribute to a process that we can work with locally, which, it hasn't really, not much has happened. It's only been a couple of months, but we are hoping to continue working across organizations, across groups, with the city of Burlington, with the state of Vermont, with the multiple levels that we can access politically here in Burlington, Vermont. It's a unusual place because we do have pretty ready access to our politicians. They're not that far removed from us, whereas at the national level and
right?
the international level, we don't have that. Sorry?
It's Bernie Sanders territory.
It's Bernie Sanders territory, sure, yeah. Bernie he was mayor of Burlington for a decade. He had his critics and from the left and from the Greens and stuff, but nevertheless, we still love him.
This past weekend, I went to an event called the Extinction Rebellion, which started in the UK in response to what's happening across the planet. And I was struck as I was listening to you that there are so many initiatives right now, and yet we can't seem to adequately network to really build the kind of power we need to build. And I wonder whether that's a question of that once we try to pull it all together, it gets too simplistic? Or is it just that we're so childish that we can't stop ourselves from reducing it all to arguments about who's more pure than the other?
Don't worry about
disruption. Jean, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Don't worry about it. It'll organically find a higher level of authority or coagulation or action when the time is more ripe. And right now you're building, everybody is building their own local community, which is going to be a lot stronger than if it's centralized over the long run, because we get picked off all the time, if, as you know, groups do. But when you have, they are springing up. I don't know what the numbers are, but I mean, I recognize what you said. Of course, but I wouldn't worry about coalescing faster than what's going on its own. The Women's March and the March on Science, a little around the same time, just kind of happened. And of course, the March on Science has kind of fallen back, but it was a lot of fun, actually. But it invigorated a lot of people to go back, and there were ones in all kinds of towns. I went up to DC, but I think those things happen. And the same thing happened with civil rights. I know there were places that supported one view and the other ones, and another town nearby didn't, you know. I mean, it was entirely diffuse. But that's how it gradually, and then they had a very, at time when it was right, we had a top-down, not a solution, but, you know, a good action with the Civil Rights Act and so forth. I wouldn't be so hesitant to criticize our efforts. I'm not actually doing a group development myself, and I mean, I'm glad to support them, you know.
Well, I always go back to physics, and Jim, you can weigh in on how physics works in complexity. But the way I understand it works is that you do have all these apparently unrelated causal agents, and then it's just at some point how they come together relatively randomly that creates that point of causality that can change everything. And I wonder whether that is how you foresee we might get ourselves out of this mess, that we just keep letting the agents proliferate, and then we're going to have a point of emergence.
Yeah, I don't know that I would put it like that. I would go back to something I said earlier, and I'll just say it in a different way. You know, I think that the rules, if you will, are in our favor. That if we, I mean, I don't think we're headed on the wrong path. I think in general we're headed on the right path, which tells me that the rules are in our favor. We're not going to get there in a straight line. That I'm 100% confident of, because I'm living right now. But I think that really it's incumbent upon us to do two things. One is to have some faith in the direction we're going in, and the other is to keep fighting for what we think is right. Because I don't think we'll get where we want to go if we just sit back and pretend that it's just going to get there without our involvement. Right. I think we have to be part of the solution. This is something that I've been arguing with people about recently, particularly my friends in journalism. You know, I go back 10 or 15 years, they would tell me all the time that their role is not education, that their role is information. And I think that the world, I think it's changed. I think the rules are, in particular, the internet's changed the rules to some degree. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be part of the solution. And we should all be speaking up. And being quiet and pretending you don't have a role in that, I think, is wrong. And you know, I guess I'm arguing for global activism in some extent, but I think I see it, you know, less as a full-time job to be an activist as it is just it's a full-time job that I'm part of the planet and I need to be part of the solution.
Susan, I'm curious about this distinction between information and education. Do you think of your writing as falling in either category or another category or straddling the two?
No, it would definitely fall in the education category, but it's also expression. I mean, it's art, you know, so it's it's poetic, which means what that means is it goes to it addresses the unconscious. It addresses both a physical and an unconscious psychological existence, as well as the conscious thought. But I did want to say something that, and I couldn't agree more that we need to keep fighting. That's absolutely critical. We need to obtain justice. That's healing. Justice is healing to victims of rape. And then we also need to keep making these connections. I've run across a few progressive men whom I'm very fond of, and I agree with them about so many things, but they're frightened and they're angry at the Me Too movement because they're afraid they're going to get accused. I think we need to spell out the connection between rape and the domination of women and fascism. It's all over the place. It's right there in front of us, but we don't see it because it's so sort of normal. And I'm just going to give one example, which I'm reading a book about Columbine now. It's a big, thick book. It goes into the psychology of the two young men who created that massacre, and one of them, the one who was the sort of more dominant one, had rape fantasies, continual rape fantasies. He also admired Adolf Hitler and would go around saying Heil Hitler. So these two trends existed in this one person. You see this everywhere. That connection is there, but we think, oh yeah, of course those things go together, but we don't really think about what they add up to be, that it's one system, and that we can't shift the system without shifting our attitudes towards women and the position of women in society. And the vice versa is also true. We can't really improve the position of ultimately of most women in society until we change our thinking about our relationship to the earth and social justice in general.
Would any of you like to comment on that?
Amen.
As some of you know, the guiding philosophy I've been working with for some years is the idea I invented of trigger point theory, that if you layer enough data, you find a point where you can intervene and change the trajectory of what is happening. And right now, it seems to me there is so much to layer. I certainly agree with you, Susan, that we need to layer rape culture and ecocide and the strong man and all this other stuff. What are the psychological dynamics? What are the causes of those psychological damages that could cause Columbine? Or what is it that makes it so hard to organize in Burlington? How do we respond to the shutdown? These are really serious problems. Comments?
Unfortunately, my comment is I've got to sign off. So
I knew you were going to do that, Jim. I said about you, you come late and you leave early. It's inexcusable. Cutting corners. That's a problem.
I have a day job.
Well, we have about 3 minutes left. Would anybody like to add something to our wonderful conversation?
Well, the most effective place, or a very effective place, is when problems are small and not when they're big. If you have a tipping point when they're a 3 or 5 or 7-year-old and change things over rather than wait until they're a 72-year-old, misfit. I think you really want as much as possible to have a sympathetic ear with an understanding of what the issue is when you're a friend and when you're an uncle or when you're a grandmother, because you can say things easier at that stage and have more long-lasting effects. So you have fewer things to kind of reorient. If you just kind of take somebody and tap them on the shoulder and say, let's not do that. We don't do that here. Or, respect this person. Or, do you know that they spent 3 hours working at the volunteer center last week? I think the most effective way is to do things at the lowest level possible. Because when you have binary choices and you get up to the top, it's very hard to turn the ship around with a small rudder. It's a lot easier when they're small. The boat is small and you get a hold of the tiller yourself.
Yeah, we've got a tanker right now.
No, I know.
Well, that's proving true with a lot of local responses to immigration to ecology. I mean, California is way out ahead of the federal government in ecological responses, and I hope under Gavin Newsom will be even more so. So I think local level politics is a source of a lot of hope, because people can see what's going on, they feel it. Their neighbors, they can empathize with their neighbors, even if it's not affecting them directly. So I really agree with you about that. But I do think we can't leave the macro, the other level. We can't ignore that. We do have to respond to it too.
Adrian, we just have about 1 minute left. And I apologize that you didn't get all the information you needed in a timely manner. Apparently, neither did Susan. But I wonder whether you have any comments about what you heard in the past half hour before we close up.
Well, just riffing on the last couple of comments, I agree that that starting locally and starting at the bottom level makes sense, but I also think that it's important to look for those maybe mid-level places where it's important to create storylines, to create images that can build connections between local groups or between different groups. That's an important layer to work at as well, without forgetting the very local and the more immediate level.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's about it, unless somebody else has some last words. Thank you, Susan, for sticking with us for a whole hour. I was watching the time and really delighted that you could continue to be with us.
Oh, it was a great conversation. Thank you for setting it all up.
Oh, good. Wonderful.
Nice meeting you, Susan.
Very nice meeting you, Gene.
Nice meeting you, Adrian.
Nice meeting both of you.
Yes.
Bye, you guys. I think
thank you.
Gene and I will stay on the phone for a little bit longer.